The history of American food. Collegedale, Tennessee, my father's hometown, is a relatively small city. It relies heavily on the 3,000 jobs that are created by the McKee Foods Little Debbie factories located in the middle of town. In 1978, my dad first began working in the factory and would constantly swipe Star Crunch Cosmic snacks off the assembly line when they were still hot. McKee Foods Corporation was started in Tennessee when O.D. McKee and his wife sold 5-cent cakes out of the back of their car during the Great Depression. Today his company has annual sales of $1.1 billion and is host to 4 factory locations in 3 different states. And their success story isn't an outlier. Since 1900, the American diet has steadily moved away from cultural ethnic meals and towards more processed and industrialized food products. The 1900s were a major force of change in the cuisine of America. 1 million new immigrants were coming into the country every year, and most streamed into highly populous cities to take advantage of industrial factory jobs. Mass immigration and rapid industrialization gave rise to new food influences and helped spur the beginnings of restaurants for the growing middle class. Sweets and candies were much more available in America, which is why, in 1909, the average American was consuming 65 pounds of sugar per year. Domino Sugar was thereby one of the most successful food companies in early America. Kellogg's, Heinz, and Quaker Oats were other major food companies to arise during this time. However, many still held tightly to their own cultural heritage with regards to food. World War I began in 1914, which quickly led to rationing. Food companies soon began developing vegetable oils, corn syrup, and canned foods to replace their ration counterparts. Companies such as Campbell's, Hellmann's, and Crisco were created during this decade and would be widely used even after the war had ended. And although sugar was limited, sweets like Oreos and Cracker Jacks were definitely not. The 20s ushered in a new era of cooking at home. Supermarkets like Kroger's began popping up all over the country, offering a variety of dry foods and some dairy products, but no meat or produce of any kind. Processed food companies enjoyed these new supermarkets since their products dominated the shelves. Affordable refrigerators also came into fashion during this time, allowing Americans to buy more spoilable foods like fruits and vegetables. The most notable influence of the 20s, however, was Prohibition. Soda sales skyrocketed thanks to the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920. Automated vending machines were invented, and supermarkets sold soda cans in 6-packs called home packs. Speakeasies and illegal bars soon became a common occurrence in large cities, and even expensive restaurants eventually began selling liquor in secret. Although Prohibition ended in 1933, Americans were far from carefree. The Great Depression, which began in October of 1929, meant that food lines and soup kitchens sprang up across the nation and mothers were cooking meatless one-pot meals. Many families simply couldn't afford fresh produce, meat, or dairy products, which is why inexpensive processed foods like Kraft macaroni and cheese and Spam were popular. During World War II, from 1941 to 1945, Americans had to eat carefully and frugally. Many households planted victory gardens, which accounted for 40% of America's vegetables in 1943. Women, after going to work in their husbands' places, started using more processed foods in the kitchen because they had less time to prepare meals. Convenience became a major selling point for packaged food everywhere. Although women retired their positions when men came home from war, they still embraced the convenience of processed and fast foods. McDonald's opened drive-thru restaurants, and new TV programs included recipes that relied heavily on packaged or pre-made food. By 1950, 6 million televisions were located throughout America, which meant food companies could advertise directly to their consumer, and TV-related food was all the rage. The Swanson TV dinner and finger foods that were easily eaten in front of a television, like fish sticks and Chex Mix, were extremely popular. Corn-derived sweeteners were constantly being experimented with in these types of foods, and Sweet and Low was one of the first corn-based coffee sweeteners accepted nationwide. The overabundance of processed foods evident during these times, however, would soon be questioned. In the 1960s, convenience foods were all the rage. Pop-Tarts, Gatorade, Cool Whip, and Tang first made their debuts in this era, and in 1967, high-fructose corn syrup was developed. It soon became a sweetener of choice for large food manufacturers, especially soda companies. Coca-Cola and Pepsi loved it because it was much easier to dissolve in water. However, the food industry began showing its darker side. Rachel Carson published the book Silent Spring in 1962, which warned Americans of the dangers of the pesticides being used on their foods. This controversial book and debate over the Vietnam War around 1964 were some of the major reasons why a huge gap in food culture emerged. Hippies began farming their own vegetables in co-ops and urban gardens across the country, and vegetarianism also became a lifestyle adopted to challenge corporate America. Furthermore, the civil rights movement that began in 1961 meant hippies and political activists started eating soul food in support of African American suffrage and rights. Things that were white and industrialized, like Wonder Bread white flour and sugary cereals, also became synonymous for white power and domination, while brown foods like granola, unshelled rice, and whole wheat breads were a sign of acceptance and support for the civil rights movement. Despite a recent surge of more natural foods, obesity in America was steadily rising. In 1977, the Committee of Nutrition published a report saying Americans should reduce saturated fat intake. Therefore, in the 80s and 90s, food companies began to market their food as healthful and nutritious. Creative packaging promised more fiber or more protein, yet these products still contain loads of salt, sugar, and fat. Unsurprisingly, obesity in America continued to worsen. In 1990, the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act and the Organic Foods Production Act were passed to regulate all nutrition labeling in the United States. Claims such as low fat or high fiber now had to meet certain regulations before they could be printed on products, and the United States Department of Agriculture was given permission to set up strict organic standards. In the 21st century, processed foods are much more creative, and food science has become a serious enterprise. Howard Moskowitz is an extremely popular Harvard graduate whose claim to fame is his ability to find a consumer's bliss point when it comes to a processed food product. The bliss point, in its simplest definition, is a careful balance of packaging, flavor, and texture that creates a product irresistible to consumers. Moskowitz can also describe a plethora of other terms like sensory-specific satiety and mouthfeel. In order to find the perfect combination, a food company will conduct up to 3,000 different tastings before creating a parabolic graph that shows how to achieve a product's bliss point for the lowest price possible. Fortunately, we also live in a time when alternative methods of food production are gaining significant ground. Natural food options are becoming more popular than ever. In 2007, the U.S. Department of Agriculture found that more than 12,000 farms in the United States sold products through community-supported agriculture programs, and the sheer amount of USDA-approved organic products is startling. Although some will argue that the authenticity of organic food is lost when large-scale businesses begin to adopt these types of products, there's no denying that the American diet is moving in the right direction. America's eating habits have changed drastically since the beginning of the 20th century. Big food companies have only seemed to strengthen with the passage of time, but this tradition doesn't have to continue. We, American consumers, are the ones with the real power. We can decide whether we'll eat Little Debbie's Star Crunch snacks or homemade pies. We can eat Wonder Bread or whole wheat bread, sugar or high fructose corn syrup, processed food or wholesome food. We get to choose. And our choices show the industrial food giants what the consumer wants and what we value as a population. So my only question is this: what does our time period want to be remembered for?